Izzy, I'm going to direct this one to you. Legalized gambling came to Atlantic City in the late 70s. Your most recent book, Casino Gaming in Atlantic City, a 30-year retrospective. As we all know, gambling, entertainment, vice, and wild tourist attractions have been a big part of the resort's attraction for a long time, prior to the opening of resorts in the late 70s. Can you speak to some of that, the business side of that?
I'm gonna take a page out of your book. I want to ask some questions.
Here it is.
How many of you think, you mentioned Nucky Johnson, or I mentioned Nucky Johnson, how many of you think Nucky Johnson was responsible for building Atlantic City in its heyday?
I do.
You do?
Yeah.
Let me ask the question the other way. How many of you think Atlantic City made Nucky Johnson?
I think it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think it goes both ways. But I want to give the perspective, if you bear with me on this, that I think Atlantic City.
Talk to them, man.
I'll talk to them. I'm talking to you. If you know, you think about Atlantic City in the 1920s, everybody talks about, obviously with the popularity of Levenson Johnson's book, Boardwalk Empire, and the show you'll see this evening, we all know that illegal gambling, booze, broads played a big deal in that era. But I'm going to try to convince you that that is not what built Atlantic City. Even though those were important attractions, I'm not going to deny it. But you talked about the healthful reasons that people came here. You know, 15 million people came here in the 1920s. Anybody know the population in the 1920s? Population of the United States. You got 15 million people coming to Atlantic City on a population of about 120, 130 million. Turn the clock forward, 2010, 30 million people, 300 million population. You're still at about 10%. So I'm struck with the fact that in its so-called heyday, 10% of the US population would find its way to Atlantic City. That's still true. You mentioned the trains. 100 trains a day came into Atlantic City in the summertime. 100 trains a day in the summer. That was on weekends. I don't mean to say every single day, but in weekends. There were about 300 conventions a year here throughout the 1920s. Certainly by 1929, when what is now Boardwalk Hall opened, you had another venue for conventions from 1929 on. But even in the 1920s, hundreds of thousands of people came to Atlantic City for legitimate business reasons. There were 1,200. I still don't believe that number, but I've had that. And Boo, I'll have to rely on you. Is that 1,200 hotels and lodges in Atlantic City?
I can't, it depends on when you're talking about specifically.
1920s.
I can't, I'd be guessing to say I know now, but it could be very conceivable to be that many.
30 along the boardwalk, 30 of the major hotels along the boardwalk, 1,200 hotels. Now, keep in mind, that was before 1920. When were most of those hotels built? Everybody know? The big hotels that were lining the boardwalk in the 1920s. They were built from about the 1870s, and they were built in stages, 1860s, 1870s. By 1920, most of the boardwalk was done. The Claridge, I think, opened in 1930, around that era. But most of them were really done. So the point that I think I'd like to make is that Atlantic City was a legitimate, big commercial success with a variety of entertainment options in the 1920s. By the time Nucky Johnson came on the scene, he already had a successful commercial enterprise going. The city was working. He had the icing on the cake, I'll admit, but the city was certainly commercially successful from a business point of view and from a tourist destination point of view. I saw, and I'll close with this, and I'll let you guys jump in, but I saw an article, I believe it was in the New York Times or the New York Sun, where someone tried to write a history of the United States in 11 words. History is Columbus, Washington, Lincoln, Volstead, of course the guy that the Prohibition Act was named, he wrote the legislation. Volstead, then 2 flights up and talked to a guy named Gus. That was basically the history of Atlantic City. 2 flights up and talk to Gus. But even though those were great amenities, that wasn't, I think, the reason that Atlantic City was successful. And that,
he looks as cold as an Eskimo, but there's fire in his eyes. He doesn't say very much, but when he's starting to speak, you'd be surprised. He's not so good at the start, but at the end of a week, you'd be surprised. On a streetcar or in a train, you'd think he was born without any brain, but in a taxi cab, oh boy, you'd be surprised.